you doing in this neighborhood?
I'm pulling into my own garage. You're blocking my driveway. State your reasonable suspicion.
Step out. We're searching the vehicle.
No consent, no warrant. Touch my phone again and you're seizing evidence.
Stop recording or you're going to
You're gonna
jail.
arrest a federal judge on camera. Say you're bad.
It was supposed to be a quiet Thursday evening. The kind of evening where you come home from work, pull into your own garage, and finally let go of the day's heavy burden. But for me, that simple act of arriving home would trigger a chain of events, so shocking, so outrageous, that it would end careers, destroy lives, and expose a pattern of racism that had been hiding in plain sight for years. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button because what unfolds next will leave you absolutely speechless. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this story develops. I am Judge Marcus Thorne, a 55-year-old federal judge who has dedicated my entire career to upholding justice and protecting constitutional rights. I lived in an upscale neighborhood in the suburbs of Atlanta, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and children rode bicycles on tree-lined streets. I had moved there 3 years earlier, after my appointment to the federal bench, choosing the quiet community, specifically because I wanted peace and privacy after long days in the courthouse. That Thursday evening in late September, I was returning home from a particularly challenging day. I had presided over a complex civil rights case, reviewed dozens of legal briefs, and attended a judicial conference that ran late into the evening. All I wanted was to get inside my house, pour myself a glass of bourbon, and catch up on some reading before bed. I had no idea that my life was about to change forever. As I turned onto my street, just after 8 p.m., I noticed something unusual. 2 police cruisers were parked near the corner, which was odd, because this neighborhood rarely saw any police presence. I thought perhaps there had been a break-in or some minor incident, but I didn't give it much more consideration. I simply wanted to get home. I pulled into my driveway and pressed the garage door opener. The familiar mechanical whir filled the evening air as the door slowly lifted. I had performed this exact routine hundreds of times before. Pull into the driveway, wait for the garage to open, drive inside, close the door, and enter my house through the connecting door. Simple routine, completely normal. But as I began to drive into my garage, I noticed movement in my rearview mirror. The 2 police cruisers had suddenly come to life, their headlights cutting through the growing darkness as they drove quickly down the street toward my house. My first thought was that perhaps they were responding to an emergency call nearby. I continued into my garage, expecting them to drive past. They didn't drive past. Instead, both vehicles turned sharply into my driveway, blocking my exit. The garage door was still open, and I found myself trapped inside my own garage with 2 police cars positioned behind me. Red and blue lights began flashing, casting eerie shadows on the walls of my garage. This was when I knew something was terribly wrong. Sergeant Bill Rooker stepped out of the first cruiser. He was a 20-year veteran of the force, with a reputation for being aggressive and quick to escalate situations. His partner, Officer Greg Polson, emerged from the passenger side. Both men were white. Both appeared agitated, and both seemed to have already made up their minds about what they were dealing with before they had even spoken to me. From the second cruiser came Officer Mike Vance and his rookie partner, Officer Tim Hayes. Vance had been on the force for 8 years and had developed what his colleagues euphemistically called a proactive approach to policing. Hayes was fresh out of the academy, eager to prove himself, and unfortunately about to learn the wrong lessons from the wrong officers. I remained in my car, unsure of what was happening. Through my side mirror, I could see the officers approaching my vehicle. Sergeant Rooker walked directly to my driver's side window and tapped on it with his flashlight. Even though the garage was well lit and there was no need for additional illumination, I rolled down my window and calmly asked what the problem was. Rooker immediately demanded to see my identification. When I asked why I was being stopped, Rooker's response was both telling and legally problematic. He said they had received reports of suspicious activity in the neighborhood and needed to verify who I was and what I was doing there. With my extensive legal background, I immediately recognized several issues with this explanation. First, I was clearly entering my own garage attached to my own house. Second, no specific criminal activity had been alleged. Third, the officers had provided no reasonable, articulable suspicion that would justify a stop under the Fourth Amendment. But I also knew that challenging police officers in the heat of the moment could escalate a situation unnecessarily. I reached for my wallet to retrieve my driver's license. Moving slowly and deliberately to avoid any misunderstandings as I handed Rooker my identification, I politely but firmly asked again what this was about. Rooker barely glanced at the license before asking me what I was doing in this neighborhood. The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. What was I doing in this neighborhood? I lived here. This was my house, my garage, my driveway. The implication was clear and insulting. In Rooker's mind, a black man did not belong in this upscale, predominantly white neighborhood. Regardless of my obvious means to afford living there, or the fact that I was clearly entering my own home, I felt a familiar knot forming in my stomach. I had experienced racism throughout my career, subtle and not so subtle instances where my qualifications were questioned, my authority undermined, or my presence in professional spaces treated as somehow inappropriate. But this felt different. This was happening at my own home, in my own garage, by officers who were supposed to serve and protect all citizens equally. I answered Rooker's question with remarkable composure. I told him that I lived in this house, that this was my garage, and that I was simply coming home from work. Rooker looked skeptical, as if the very idea of a black man owning property in this neighborhood was inherently suspicious. Officer Polson, Rooker's partner, walked around to the passenger side of my car and peered inside using his flashlight to examine the interior. He asked me to step out of the vehicle. I asked why this was necessary, pointing out that I had provided identification and explained that I was at my own home. Rooker's response revealed the true nature of what was happening. He said that they needed to verify my story because there had been break-ins in the area recently, and my presence here late at night fit the profile of someone who might be casing houses for future burglaries. Let me pause here for a moment. Have you ever experienced or witnessed something like this? Type yes in the comments if you have, because what happened next would test every ounce of my legal training and personal restraint. The profile Rooker mentioned was particularly offensive because it was so obviously based on nothing more than my race. I was well-dressed, driving a luxury sedan, entering a garage with an electronic opener, and clearly belonged in the neighborhood. The only thing that made me fit any profile was the color of my skin. I stepped out of my car, knowing that cooperation was my best strategy for de-escalating the situation, even though every fiber of my being wanted to assert my rights and demand that these officers leave my property immediately. I was acutely aware that as a federal judge, any incident involving law enforcement could become a matter of public record and potentially impact my career. Officer Vance joined the group, making the situation even more intimidating. 3 armed officers were now surrounding me in my own garage, treating me like a criminal suspect rather than a homeowner who had just arrived home from work. The 4th officer Hayes remained by the police cars, presumably to call for backup if needed. Rooker asked me if I had any weapons in the car. I replied that I did not. He asked if I would consent to a search of my vehicle. This request was particularly galling because it demonstrated just how far these officers were willing to go based on absolutely no legitimate suspicion of criminal activity. I politely declined to consent to a search, explaining that I had committed no crime and there was no reasonable basis for such a request. Rooker's expression darkened. He clearly wasn't used to people asserting their constitutional rights, particularly black men, in situations like this. Paulson suggested that they should call for additional units, claiming that I was being uncooperative. The irony was staggering. A federal judge, standing in his own garage, being accused of uncooperativeness for declining to waive his Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable searches. What happened next would transform this from a case of racial profiling into something far more serious, with consequences that would reverberate through the entire police department and ultimately cost multiple officers their careers. But the officers had no idea who they were dealing with, and I was about to make a decision that would change everything. The tension in that garage was reaching a breaking point, and neither side was backing down. What these officers didn't realize was that they had just made the worst mistake of their professional lives, targeting someone who not only understood the law better than they did, but who had the power and knowledge to ensure that justice would be served. That justice would be served. I made a decision that would prove to be absolutely brilliant. I pulled out my cell phone and began recording. I didn't hide it or try to be sneaky about it. I held the phone up clearly, making sure the camera captured all 4 officers and the entire interaction. The moment that camera came out, everything changed. Sergeant Rooker immediately demanded that I stop recording. I calmly explained that I had every legal right to record police officers performing their duties in a public space. Rooker stepped closer, his voice rising as he ordered me to put the phone away. I did not comply. I kept recording my voice, steady and professional, as I narrated what was happening. This is when the officers made their second catastrophic mistake. Instead of recognizing that they had overstepped and backing away from the situation, they doubled down. Vance moved to block the camera angle while Paulson positioned himself near my car as if preparing to search it anyway. I spoke directly into the camera, clearly stating the date, time, and location. I identified myself only as a homeowner who was being detained without cause in his own garage. I described each officer's actions and their badge numbers, which were clearly visible on their uniforms. My legal training was evident in how methodically I documented everything. Rooker grew increasingly agitated by my calm professional demeanor. He seemed to expect fear or submission, but instead faced someone who understood his rights better than Rooker understood his own authority. He threatened to arrest me for obstruction of justice. I asked him to specify exactly what justice I was obstructing by standing in my own garage and exercising my constitutional rights. The question hung in the air because Rooker had no good answer. There was no investigation being obstructed, no crime being prevented, no legitimate law enforcement purpose being served. They were simply harassing a black man for having the audacity to exist in an upscale neighborhood. Officer Hayes, the rookie, looked increasingly uncomfortable as the situation escalated. Later testimony would reveal that he had tried to suggest they should leave, but the senior officers ignored him. This was supposed to be a learning experience for the new officer, but he was learning all the wrong lessons about policing. Paulson made the third devastating mistake of the evening. He reached for my phone, attempting to grab it from my hands. I clearly stated that he was trying to destroy evidence, and that I did not consent to being touched or having my property seized. The entire exchange was captured on video as Paulson's hand made contact with both the phone and my arm. What happened next would become the focal point of multiple investigations and lawsuits. Rooker announced that I was under arrest for resisting arrest. The circular logic was stunning. I was being arrested for resisting an arrest that had no legal basis in the first place. It was like something out of a dystopian novel, except it was happening in real life in an American garage. As Rooker moved to handcuff me, I made one final attempt to resolve the situation peacefully. I told the officers that I was a federal judge, thinking that this revelation might bring some sanity to the proceedings. I was wrong. Rooker accused me of lying and impersonating a federal official, adding another charge to his growing list of false accusations. I was handcuffed in my own garage while my cell phone continued recording from where it had fallen when Paulson grabbed it. The video captured me being led past my own car, through my own garage, and placed in the back of a police cruiser. The absurdity of the situation was breathtaking, but the officers weren't finished. Vance decided they needed to search my house for evidence of the break-ins they claimed to be investigating. This decision would prove to be their final and most costly mistake. Without a warrant, without consent, and without any exigent circumstances, they began attempting to enter my home. The house alarm system activated when they tried to open the connecting door from the garage. The piercing sound echoed through the neighborhood, waking residents and drawing attention to what was happening. Several neighbors came outside to see what was causing the commotion. Some began recording with their own phones. One neighbor, an elderly white woman named Mrs. Higgins, who had lived on the street for 30 years, approached the scene. She knew me well and had nothing but respect for me. When she saw me handcuffed in the police car, she immediately began asking the officers what was happening. Rooker told Mrs. Higgins to mind her own business and return to her house. When she persisted in asking questions, he threatened to arrest her for interfering with a police investigation. This threat against a prominent community member who was clearly just concerned about her neighbor would later become another piece of evidence in the pattern of misconduct. Mrs. Higgins was not easily intimidated. She had been a civil rights lawyer before retiring and knew exactly what she was witnessing. She began documenting everything, taking photos of the officers' badge numbers and license plates. She also called 911 to report what appeared to be police harassment of her neighbor. The 911 call created an interesting situation. The dispatcher had to figure out how to respond to a report of police misconduct that was supposedly being committed by officers who were already on scene. Eventually, a supervisor was contacted and told to respond to my address immediately. Meanwhile, the officers continued their unlawful search of my property. They found nothing suspicious because there was nothing suspicious to find. My house was immaculately maintained, filled with legal books, judicial awards, and evidence of a distinguished career in public service. But by now, the officers were too invested in their narrative to admit they had made a mistake. Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins arrived as the supervising officer and immediately recognized that something was seriously wrong. She found me still handcuffed in the police car and 4 officers who couldn't provide a coherent explanation for why they had arrested a homeowner in his own garage. When Jenkins reviewed my identification and realized I actually was a federal judge, her face went pale. Jenkins immediately ordered that I be uncuffed and released. She then had a heated discussion with Rooker and the other officers away from the recording devices. What she told them in that private conversation was never officially documented, but witnesses reported hearing raised voices and what sounded like a supervisor delivering a severe reprimand. I was finally free, but the damage was done. I had been handcuffed and arrested in my own home without cause. My property had been illegally searched. I had been treated like a criminal by officers who were supposed to protect and serve me, and all of it had been captured on multiple video recordings that would soon change everything. The immediate aftermath was almost as telling as the incident itself. Rooker attempted to write a police report that would justify their actions, claiming that I had been acting suspiciously and had resisted their investigation. His report made no mention of the fact that I was in my own garage, or that I had immediately identified myself as the homeowner. Paulson and Vance supported Rooker's version of events in their reports, creating what appeared to be a coordinated attempt to cover up their misconduct. Only Hayes, the rookie officer, expressed reservations about the narrative being constructed. His honest account would later prove crucial in unraveling the lies his colleagues had told. I spent that night documenting everything that had happened. I reviewed the video recordings, wrote a detailed timeline of events, and began researching the legal options available to me. As a federal judge, I had seen countless cases of police misconduct, but experiencing it firsthand gave me a new perspective on the trauma and humiliation that victims endured. The next morning, I made several phone calls that would set in motion a series of events that none of the officers involved could have imagined. I contacted the FBI's Civil Rights Division, the local U.S. Attorney's Office, and the Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. I also reached out to several civil rights organizations and journalists who specialized in covering police misconduct. Quick question for everyone watching. Do you think the officers realized how much trouble they were in at this point? Type your thoughts in the comments. The story broke 2 days later when a local news station obtained copies of the video recordings. The footage was damning. It showed 4 white police officers harassing a black man in his own garage, arresting him without cause, and attempting to search his home without a warrant. The optics were terrible, but the legal implications were even worse. The police department initially tried to defend the officers' actions, releasing a statement that claimed they had been responding to reports of suspicious activity and had followed proper procedures. This narrative collapsed within hours when multiple witnesses came forward to contradict the official version of events. Mrs. Higgins, the neighbor, who had witnessed everything, gave a television interview that destroyed the police department's credibility. She explained that there had been no recent break-ins in the neighborhood and no reports of suspicious activity. She also revealed that she had seen the officers sitting in their cars for over an hour before they decided to target me, suggesting that the stop was premeditated rather than responsive. The revelation that I was a federal judge added another layer of complexity to the story. Legal experts began analyzing the incident on television, explaining how every action taken by the officers had violated clearly established constitutional rights. The fact that they had targeted a sitting federal judge made the misconduct even more egregious and ensured that the case would receive national attention. By the end of the week, the story had gone viral on social media. The hashtag Justice for Judge Thorne began trending as people shared the video and expressed their outrage. Civil rights organizations called for immediate action against the officers involved. Legal scholars wrote opinion pieces about the broader implications of police officers targeting members of the judiciary. The officers involved had no idea that their decision to profile and harass me would ultimately expose a pattern of misconduct that had been hidden for years. Internal Affairs began investigating not just the incident itself, but the officers' entire history of interactions with minority citizens. What they found would shock even seasoned investigators and lead to consequences that would reverberate through the entire department. Rooker's personnel file revealed a disturbing pattern that somehow had been overlooked or ignored by his supervisors. He had received numerous complaints over the years, almost all from Black and Hispanic citizens, who alleged they had been stopped, searched, or detained without cause. The complaints had been routinely dismissed or resulted in minimal discipline, allowing Rooker to continue his pattern of behavior unchecked. One particular complaint stood out among the dozens in Rooker's file. 3 years earlier, a Black attorney named Kevin Lewis had filed a detailed report alleging that Rooker had pulled him over for no apparent reason while he was driving through the same upscale neighborhood where I lived. Lewis claimed that Rooker had searched his car, questioned his right to be in the area, and made several racially charged comments during the encounter. The complaint had been investigated by Rooker's direct supervisor, at the time Lieutenant Mark Stevens, who concluded that Lewis's allegations were unsubstantiated. Stevens had accepted Rooker's explanation that he had stopped the attorney for a minor traffic violation and that Lewis had been uncooperative and hostile. No disciplinary action was taken, and Rooker received nothing more than a verbal counseling session. But now, with my incident under federal investigation, Lewis's complaint was being re-examined with fresh eyes. Investigators discovered that Stevens had never interviewed the witnesses that Lewis had provided. He had never requested dashcam footage from Rooker's patrol car. He had never even visited the location where the stop allegedly occurred to verify Rooker's version of events. The pattern became clearer as investigators dug deeper. Polson's file contained similar red flags. He had been the subject of 6 formal complaints in 8 years of service, all involving allegations of excessive force or discriminatory treatment. Like Rooker, he had managed to avoid serious consequences because supervisors had consistently given him the benefit of the doubt when his word was pitted against that of minority complainants. Vance's record was perhaps the most disturbing of all. Despite having only 8 years on the force, he had accumulated more complaints than officers with twice his experience. Several involved allegations that he had used racial slurs during arrests or traffic stops. One particularly damning incident involved a Black teenager who claimed Vance had planted evidence during a drug search. The teenager's mother had tried to pursue the matter through official channels, but her complaints had been dismissed when Vance and his partner provided contradicting testimony. No one had thought to check whether Vance had a pattern of such behavior because the complaints were handled individually without anyone looking for broader trends. Internal affairs investigators also discovered something that would prove to be explosive evidence in the federal case against the officers. The police department's computer system automatically logged every time officers ran license plates or checked identification through their patrol car terminals. A review of Rooker's activity logs revealed a shocking pattern of behavior. Over the past 2 years, Rooker had run license plate checks on vehicles parked in upscale neighborhoods at a rate far exceeding any legitimate law enforcement purpose. The vast majority of these checks occurred during evening hours, when residents were likely to be arriving home from work. Most telling of all the vehicles he targeted belonged disproportionately to Black and Hispanic owners. This data proved that Rooker's targeting of me was not an isolated incident or a case of poor judgment in the heat of the moment. It was part of a systematic pattern of racial profiling that he had been conducting for years. He had been essentially hunting for opportunities to harass minority residents in affluent neighborhoods. The revelation sent shockwaves through the police department's leadership. Chief Miller, a 25-year veteran who had prided himself on running a professional organization, found himself facing the worst scandal of his career. The data showed that his department had not only failed to detect this pattern of misconduct, but had actively covered it up through inadequate investigations and superficial disciplinary actions. Chief Miller called an emergency meeting with his command staff to discuss the crisis. According to sources who attended the meeting, the chief was furious that such widespread misconduct had been allowed to flourish under his watch. He ordered a complete review of all complaints filed against Rooker-Polson and Vance over the previous 5 years. The review uncovered 43 separate complaints against the 3 officers combined. When investigators reached out to the complainants, they found that many had given up on the official process after their initial reports were dismissed or inadequately investigated. Several said they had evidence to support their claims but had never been asked to provide it. Maria Gonzalez, a nurse who lived 2 blocks from me, had filed a complaint against Vance 18 months earlier. She alleged that he had stopped her while she was jogging through her own neighborhood, demanded to see identification, and questioned whether she had permission to be in the area. When she explained that she lived nearby, Vance had allegedly told her that people like her needed to stay where they belonged. Gonzalez's complaint had been dismissed after Vance claimed he had stopped her because she matched the description of a suspect in a nearby burglary. But when investigators reviewed the incident reports from that time period, they found no record of any burglary in the area. Vance had apparently fabricated the entire justification for the stop. The federal investigation moved quickly once the FBI became involved. Special Agent Rebecca Morrison, who specialized in civil rights violations by law enforcement officers, was assigned to lead the case. Morrison had prosecuted dozens of similar cases across the country and immediately recognized the severity of what had happened to me. Morrison's team began by conducting a comprehensive review of all available evidence. They analyzed the video recordings frame by frame, interviewed every witness, and subpoenaed all relevant police records. They also began reaching out to other potential victims who might have been targeted by the same officers. The legal strategy was clear from the beginning. Morrison intended to prove that the officers had violated my civil rights under federal law, specifically Title 18, Section 242 of the United States Code, which makes it a crime for anyone acting under color of law to willfully deprive a person of rights protected by the Constitution. The charges against Rooker-Polson and Vance would be severe. Each officer faced potential federal felony convictions that could result in significant prison time. Rooker, as the lead officer who had initiated the stop and made the arrest, faced the most serious exposure. His actions could potentially result in a 10-year federal sentence if prosecutors could prove that his conduct was willful and that he had intended to violate my rights. But the federal investigation was just one part of the legal storm that was gathering around the officers. I had also filed a civil lawsuit against the officers individually and the police department as a whole. My legal team, led by prominent civil rights attorney Jonathan Pierce, was preparing a case that could result in millions of dollars in damages. Pierce had handled numerous high-profile police misconduct cases and knew exactly how to build a compelling argument for both compensatory and punitive damages. My status as a federal judge would make me a particularly sympathetic plaintiff, and the video evidence was so clear that defending the officer's actions would be virtually impossible. The civil case would focus on several key legal theories. First, that the officers had violated my Fourth Amendment rights by stopping, detaining, and arresting me without reasonable suspicion or probable cause. Second, that they had violated my 14th Amendment rights by targeting me based on my race. Third, that the police department had failed to properly train and supervise its officers, creating an environment where such misconduct could flourish. Pierce's team also planned to introduce evidence of the pattern of misconduct by all three officers, showing that my experience was part of a broader practice of racial profiling. The discovery process would allow them to examine years of police records, complaint files, and training materials to build their case. The police union initially tried to defend the officers, claiming they had been following standard procedures and had made reasonable decisions based on the information available to them at the time. Union Representative Tom Bradley held a press conference where he argued that the officers were being unfairly vilified for doing their jobs in a difficult situation. Bradley's defense fell apart almost immediately when reporters began asking specific questions about the evidence. When asked to explain why the officers had attempted to search my home without a warrant, Bradley had no coherent answer. When pressed about the officers' failure to verify my identity before arresting me, he could only offer vague statements about officer safety and the need to make split-second decisions. The press conference became a public relations disaster for the union when Bradley suggested that I should have been more cooperative with the officers' investigation. Several reporters pointed out that I had been cooperative, had provided identification, had explained that I lived in the house, and had only asserted my constitutional rights when the officers began making unreasonable demands. Public opinion turned decisively against the officers as more details emerged. Editorial boards at major newspapers called for their prosecution and firing. Civil rights leaders organized protests demanding justice for me and systemic reforms to prevent similar incidents. Even some police officers began speaking out anonymously, saying that the conduct in my garage did not represent the values of professional law enforcement. The political pressure became intense when several members of Congress issued statements condemning the officers' actions. Senator Elizabeth Warren called the incident a disgraceful example of the racial profiling that continued to plague American law enforcement. Representative Hakeem Jeffries demanded a federal investigation into the police department's handling of previous complaints against the same officers. Local political leaders also began distancing themselves from the police department's handling of the situation. The mayor, who had initially expressed confidence in Chief Miller's leadership, began calling for accountability and transparency in the investigation. Several city council members demanded public hearings on police oversight and reform. The officers themselves seemed to realize that their careers were over and their legal jeopardy was serious. Rooker hired a prominent criminal defense attorney, signaling that he expected to face federal charges. Polson and Vance followed suit, retaining separate counsel to represent them in both the criminal and civil proceedings. Hayes, the rookie officer who had witnessed everything, made a decision that would prove crucial to both investigations. Against the advice of the police union, he agreed to cooperate with federal investigators and provide truthful testimony about what he had observed that night in my garage. Hayes's cooperation was significant because he had no personal history of misconduct and no apparent motive to lie about his senior colleagues. His account corroborated my version of events and contradicted the false reports that Rooker, Polson, and Vance had filed after the incident. According to Hayes's statement to federal investigators, Rooker had specifically targeted my vehicle when he saw me driving through the neighborhood. Hayes said Rooker had made a comment about checking out the black guy in the expensive car, suggesting that the stop was racially motivated from the beginning. Hayes also testified that Vance had suggested they should search my house to see what they could find, even though I had already provided identification proving I lived there. This testimony would be crucial in proving that the officers had acted with deliberate indifference to my constitutional rights. The rookie officer's willingness to tell the truth came at a personal cost. He was ostracized by many of his colleagues who viewed his cooperation as a betrayal. Several senior officers stopped speaking to him, and he began receiving anonymous, threatening messages. But Hayes understood that his integrity was worth more than the approval of corrupt colleagues. The trials took place 18 months after that Thursday evening, when I simply wanted to come home from work. Rooker received the harshest sentence, 10 years in federal prison, for willful deprivation of civil rights under color of law. Polson got 8 years, Vance received 7, and all 3 were banned from ever working in law enforcement again. The police department paid me a settlement of $12 million and agreed to comprehensive reforms under federal oversight. Chief Miller resigned in disgrace, and the entire command structure was overhauled. I returned to the bench stronger than ever, using my experience to champion civil rights cases and police accountability measures that would protect countless others from experiencing what I endured in my own garage. Sometimes justice takes time, but when it finally arrives, it arrives with the full weight of the law behind it. While this story may seem shocking, it serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of knowing your rights and the necessity of accountability within our justice system. We must judge people by the content of their character and actions, not by their appearance or zip code. Education and transparency are the tools we use to build a fairer society for everyone. This story is a dramatized retelling based on real-world events. All names, locations, and identifying details have been changed to protect the privacy of the individuals involved. This narrative is presented solely for educational purposes, to illustrate legal rights and civil liberties issues, with no intention to harm or malign any specific person or entity. You'd think it couldn't get worse than this, but the case on the right proves it can. And what unfolds there is even more unbelievable.